where you are right now?
Well, I've had a bit of a journey. I started out as a law student under the George W. Bush administration, being concerned about national security secrecy and some of the claims that the Bush administration was making to not reveal its actions in the so-called war on terror. I'm still concerned about national security secrecy and its excesses and abuses. And when I graduated law school, I worked briefly in Congress for Senator Kennedy and drafted a bill for him on trying to get judges to rein in the so-called state secrets privilege, which the executive branch asserts in court to withhold national security secrets when people are suing it for people are suing the government for abusing their rights. So I started out like a good liberal, being concerned about too much secrecy. What I came to see, however, is that the distribution of secrecy in government is deeply asymmetric. The national security agencies are very secretive, in my view, too secretive. But other parts of the government are actually quite open. That now includes much of Congress and the domestic regulatory agencies that oversee things like environmental protection, civil rights, the economy. They are substantially more transparent than the national security agencies, and in some ways, arguably, unable to do as much as one might like because of transparency. So it's not so much that I think there is too much transparency in government. Rather, I'm concerned about there being too much transparency just in a few areas where other models of accountability might be sufficient, and too little transparency in other areas where we actually need it most. Okay, I'll stop there.
Okay, and well, the second part of the question. So, what were the aha moments that brought you there?
I don't know that I have a good story about. I'll tell this story of an aha moment. I was with a colleague at the journalism school, Michael Schudson. The two of us decided to put on a conference to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Freedom of Information Act. It was signed into law in 1966 in the summer, July 4th, and in 2016 we had a big conference here at Columbia with scholars, administrators of FOIA, advocates, all coming together to think about this landmark law. And we invited a broad group to talk about the law. I received an email one day from some advocates who work on transparency issues expressing great concern that we had invited a certain prominent scholar to speak at the conference. And they this letter more or less requested that we disinvite this scholar. And the reason was that he is an enemy of transparency. That was the charge. Why is he an enemy of transparency? Because he had written some, to my mind, very mild pieces suggesting that in some ways, perhaps there was more transparency than needed or helpful in a few areas of the deliberative process where the executive branch makes decisions. I was shocked that at an academic conference there would be demands like this, that someone would be considered uninvitable because they're raising modest critical questions about the subject we're discussing. So to me, that experience reflected a kind of transparency triumphalism that I see around me in the academy and in politics and in civil society in the country, where the default assumption is that transparency is an unambiguously positive value, and that people who raise critical questions are heretics. And so I think that moment of seeing the way this scholar was attacked just for raising some tough questions about transparency was a bit eye-opening. I don't know if that qualifies as an aha moment, but that was, yeah.
Of course. All right. You mentioned the near abject lack of evidence for those who might advocate for transparency, and you further suggest that there's pretty strong evidence against their positions. Can you elaborate on some of this peculiar dynamic?
Yeah, so it's, I guess the first thing I should say is it's hard to measure the impact of transparency on governance. It's just a difficult thing to study. There are many different factors that bear on how any given government body is performing. The transparency laws are just going to be one of them, and to try to isolate the impact of transparency is difficult. Also, some of the ways in which transparency affects institutional cultures are subtle, longer term, indirect, and so further makes it difficult to study. But that said, there is not a great deal of evidence that many different transparency laws, take freedom of information laws, measurably improve the quality of governance, at least in advanced democracies like the United States. And if insofar as one of the goals, it's not the only goal, but one of the goals of such laws is to make more public interested legislation, more widely accepted legislation, or otherwise better legislation, there's not a great deal of evidence to show that those goals, that set of goals, has been achieved. Moreover, at least in the United States, one of the very explicit goals of the transparency reformers in the 1960s and the 1970s, in this foundational period of transparency law creation, was to make the government not just more effective, but more trusted. There was thought to be a real problem with public distrust of government in light of the Watergate scandal and the Vietnam War and other crises. And it was said time and again by members of Congress that if only we open up our meetings and our records to public scrutiny, we'll regain the public trust and legitimacy. Unfortunately, there's very little evidence to support that intuition, and actually quite a bit of evidence, empirical and experimental, suggesting that it's not right. It just doesn't seem to be the case that open meetings laws, open records laws, and the like generate higher levels of trust in the population toward the institutions that are opened up. And there's even some evidence or speculation that opening up bodies can sometimes just generate more and more demands for transparency and distrust at how the sausage is made. It holds government bodies potentially to unrealistic standards. It creates a kind of adversarial dynamic, or what O'Neill calls a culture of suspicion around the institutions, makes just intensifies the notion that there are watchers and there are the watched, and that there's a kind of oppositional relationship between the two. That said, the fact that trust in government has declined in the U.S. for the last several decades and in many other countries is surely determined by many factors. I would not want to suggest that transparency law has destroyed trust. I think many things have been undermining trust. But what does seem clear is that the idea that transparency would save trust, that if we just open up the process of government, will generate a virtuous cycle of legitimacy, that has not come to pass, and here or anywhere else that I know of. So trust is a little easier to measure than quality of governance generally, and the hoped for benefits of transparency reform when it comes to trust in government haven't yet materialized.
Awesome. For me as a person, I'm just making a note, like in between. For me as a person that I haven't, I haven't studied all that and so on. Like I look at Congress, for example, how is it open?
Yeah.
And the executive branch, and then I look at the Supreme Court.
Yeah, great. That's a great question.
And
So
I'm wondering.
So the Supreme Court is the most trusted branch of government by a long shot. A lot of data suggests in this country. And as you're suggesting, the Supreme Court is also in many respects a relatively secretive body compared to the other branches. Query whether there's a relationship there. But the Supreme Court is actually an interesting case study, I think, in transparency, because in some respects, it's quite opaque. A relatively small number of people can attend the oral arguments. Now you can get the audio tape, but it's not televised. So unlike congressional floor debates, say, or committee hearings, television plays a minimal role, or almost no role at the court. More importantly, I think, the deliberations of the justices about how they're going to decide the case and their drafts when they're preparing the opinion are non-public, totally secretive. Contrast that with the congressional process where in developing legislation, the public has visibility into many parts of the legislative process. You see the draft bills, you hear people debate their positions. So the inputs into Supreme Court decision making are quite opaque. But actually, when the Supreme Court does decide a case, it's very transparent. The outputs of the court, if you will, the opinions, are not only published, but they're thoroughly reasoned documents that give extensive explanations about why the justices are ruling the way they're ruling. So it's both a very non-transparent body when it comes to how it makes its decisions, but then quite transparent when it actually issues a legal ruling. And that's proven a workable formula or balance for maintaining legitimacy. Okay, maybe I'll stop at that. Yeah.
When you finish your sentence, just finish it.
Okay, sorry.
And then maybe get a pause and then tell me that's it.
Okay, all right, sorry.
So I can.
Yeah.
Afterwards. Let me just check. That's still working. Okay. 1 second. Okay. All right. Given such a limited bit of evidence for those who support a pro-transparency position, why do you suppose their advocacy is so strong, as some suggest even dogmatic, and why haven't more scholars or journalists dug deeper into these issues?
I think that increasingly scholars are raising critical questions about transparency. There's been a bit of a pendulum swing, at least in some corners of the academy, and more so in Europe, I've found, than in the United States, in questioning some of the strongest claims of the transparency movement. So I do think the ground is shifting a bit, and I think that reflects a realization that Congress has been quite incapacitated and unable to reach deals across party lines in recent years. That reflects that some of our biggest transparency laws, like FOIA, have been captured to a significant degree by corporate requesters. And that reflects as well the realization that the trust in government that people thought these laws would produce has not been produced. And so I do think there's a growing understanding that transparency is complicated and not the kind of value necessarily to be maximized, at least among scholars. It does seem to be a bit of a different story in politics and in a lot of the advocacy world. I'm not entirely sure why that is. At some point in recent years, transparency got haloed, I think, in political discourse where no one could be against it. It's politically perilous. The Freedom of Information Act, for example, has enormous symbolic significance in the United States as representing something about our commitments to democratic self-rule and accountable government, honest government. And so even if it can be shown that it has significant downsides in the ability of certain agencies to do their jobs well or in empowering certain commercial actors in ways that might be questionable, it's been a political loser to be seen as anything other than strongly supportive of that law and laws like it. In the advocacy world, I think transparency is often a valuable weapon for those on the outside of power who want to expose and attack what they see as abuses in government. At any given time, there are going to be abuses in government and those who want to expose and attack them. So there's kind of a built-in constituency for transparency as a weapon in that way. What's a little more complicated is for those who want to empower the government to do more, or to do more effectively, who therefore may have a more ambivalent relationship to transparency, we don't seem to have a vocabulary right now to explain how these groups, they're not reactionary, they don't want to bring back smoke-filled rooms where powerful private parties cut deals. They still value accountability, they still value integrity and honesty in government, and they still value transparency in some forms. It's almost like we need a new metaphor to capture what is desired there. Transparency, by the way, is an extreme metaphor. It implies total visibility, which is an unrealistic ideal for any public institution. It also doesn't capture any affirmative goal other than being see-through. In the progressive era in the early 1900s, reformers said that what they wanted was publicity. Well, that at least conjured a notion of a public, which would have certain needs and demands, and kind of yoked the reform project to the idea of the public good. In the 1960s, the language of a right to know became prominent, and that at least had a flavor of empowering citizens, and on the one hand, it became a little more adversarial and legalistic, the language, but it also, there was a bold emancipatory vision that I think was reflected in that phrase, the right to know. Now we talk about transparency, and it's as if we've lost the affirmative sense of a project of building something together, and we just want things to be see-through and hollow. And so there's a real separation I see in transparency rhetoric from other sorts of democratic and social objectives that we could be pursuing.
Yeah. So you have done a lot of work with Freedom of Information Act. Perhaps you can give a quick introduction to FOIA.
Yeah.
And they discuss a little bit about why FOIA might provide benefits to powerful groups and organized interests as opposed to the people.
Yeah.
And are there any specific examples of that you care to cite?
Great. Okay, so FOIA is the Freedom of Information Act, passed in the mid-1960s here. It's a landmark statute that gives any person, and persons include corporations as well as natural human beings, to request any record from any federal agency in the government for any reason or no reason at all. You don't have to make a case about why you need the document. You can just demand it, and the government has to turn it over to you within a short amount of time unless it falls under one of 9 exemptions. So it's a very powerful tool for seeking information from agencies in the federal executive branch. And it's been a kind of a model for many statutes around the world that have set up open records laws in a similar fashion. When FOIA was created, there was a lot of talk about how journalists would be the primary users. They would learn, they would, for purposes of their investigative reporting, use FOIA to learn what agencies were doing. And also civil society groups, watchdog groups, scientists, researchers. The idea that for-profit corporations outside of the media would use this law was not part of the original debate to any significant degree. What developed quickly, however, in practice, was that corporations who are regulated by a particular agency figured out that this was a powerful tool to learn what the regulators are up to learn potentially what competitors are up to, because the agency often collects information about the entire industry. And more than that, to gain leverage over the agency overseers, potentially, if the company was potentially going to be sued or subject to sanctions or fines or other discipline. The FOIA is cheap. The government recoups a tiny percentage of the cost that it incurs in fulfilling these requests for information. It can be quite burdensome for agencies. They have to respond to every request that comes in. And in recent years, there have been over 700,000 requests per year across the government. Also, FOIA gives you a right to sue in federal court if you feel you've been wrongly denied documents that you're owed, or if they haven't come in time, haven't come quickly. Suing the government in any effective way is expensive. It takes resources, it also takes expertise, and it takes lawyers, of course. Formulating a good FOIA request also takes some expertise and wherewithal. You have to know what to ask for in the right way, credibly threaten to sue if you're not going to get it quickly, and so forth. All of those dynamics mean you basically have to have a lot of resources to be an effective player in the FOIA game. You also have to be motivated to try to get that information. And commercial requesters both have a lot of money to pursue FOIA, and they have the motivation, a strong, steady motivation to learn what the government is up to, learn what's happening in their industry, and potentially fight off regulators who want to control them. And so it's transpired that in a number of important agencies in the government, from the Securities and Exchange Commission to the Food and Drug Administration, to numerous others, commercial requesters are way more than 50% of the requester pool, and in some agencies well over 2/3 of the requester pool. So you have this situation of what we might call corporate capture of FOIA. This law that was meant to empower ordinary individuals, citizen investigators, and journalists above all, has turned out to be a kind of subsidy to industry, which pays, again, a tiny fraction of the costs that the government incurs in fulfilling their demands for information, and then seeks to use that information and the threat of litigation to push back against regulators. To make it even more concrete, in a number of agencies, it's not just corporations that are being regulated who seek information. There's a new class of commercial requesters that's arisen in recent years, which some people call data brokers or information resellers. These are entities that their whole business model is to collect information from public records laws, compile it, and then sell it to third parties, often investors, hedge funds. And hedge funds themselves are increasingly turning to FOIA. So these companies, which at some agencies constitute over 50% themselves of the FOIA requests, will ask for tons and tons of documents from, say, the Food and Drug Administration, and then just organize all that information to try to get a sense of what kind of drugs are being regulated in what ways, and then sell it to third parties. And there's something arguably deeply perverse about the government subsidizing these private actors who are just, arbitraging information that is the government's own information for private gain. And meanwhile, journalists are a very small percentage of the FOIA requesting pool. Different studies have found slightly different numbers, but it seems to be in the 5% range of all the requests are from journalists. It varies a little bit by agency. At the state level, every state in the United States has its own freedom of information law, somewhat like FOIA. The percentage seems to be even lower of journalists submitting requests. And the result is that we have we've drifted very far from the original vision of FOIA towards this more commercial application of the law.
The lobbies are happy.
A lot of companies are, and this, by the way, this makes FOIA very resilient. I mean, if they're arguably, you could spin this in a much more positive way than perhaps I have. You could, corporations may have legitimate reasons for wanting this information. Of course, government regulators can get out of line. It also makes FOIA particularly immune from retrenchment. So if there were a politician out there who wanted to cut back on FOIA in a big way, not only would nonprofit groups, transparency advocates be very unhappy, but a lot of powerful companies would too. So it has insulated FOIA from meaningful retrenchment, the fact that it has such a powerful corporate lobby at this point.
Can I ask you to move slightly?
Yeah.
Just a little, the chair, just a little there.
Okay.
It's really interesting, by the way.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. You make an excellent argument of how transparency reforms have come to replace other, perhaps stronger types of good governance. This is an argument I had never considered before, and it rings true. Can you discuss this a bit?
I think transparency perpetually seduces reformers, in part because it's cheap, as compared to other sorts of regulations that might likewise get at worrisome practices, whether it's bans on those practices, or mandates, requirements that something be done, or taxes, licensing rules, all these tougher forms of regulation. Transparency often is relatively cheap to implement, and also easier to assemble a diverse political coalition around the strategy. For the same reason, though, I think there's a concern that transparency will not just complement other forms of regulation, but in fact take their place, substitute for them. And this would be okay if transparency on its own could achieve public objectives and protect vulnerable groups. But in area after area after area, transparency fixes by themselves have proven inadequate to do that. So in the United States, since roughly the 1980s, there's been a big movement to move away from heavy-handed sorts of regulation that just tell businesses and people what to do, and toward lighter touch forms of regulation that are thought to be less coercive, less heavy-handed, less disruptive of the market. Transparency being the number one example of that kind of regulation. So instead of telling a company, this actually happened in the US, you may not use conflict minerals in your supply chains, minerals from, the phrase, right? Come out of a civil war. Okay, you may not use conflict minerals in your supply chain. Instead, we say you have to disclose. You have to give annual reports about the sourcing of your minerals. And instead of telling companies you must have certain forms of diversity on your boards, as countries like Norway does, we say you have to disclose the diversity characteristics of your board. And instead of telling companies that there are certain maximum limits on executive compensation, we say you have to disclose the amount of money that your chief executive officer are making, and so forth. And the concern is that the move to transparency has blunted political will to try more ambitious efforts to get at some of these problems, and been insufficient, however, to deal with the problems. So let me give a particularly acute example of what I'm describing. There's when the Obama administration, I'll give a few. When the Obama administration started to get worried about runaway executive compensation, and there was a lot of political uproar in the Great Recession about how much some CEOs were making in a way that seemed divorced from the company's performance. The Obama administration flirted with imposing hard caps on certain forms of compensation, and instead it went with the transparency solution, a disclosure solution. And the evidence suggests that executive compensation went up, went up following that rule, as CEOs suddenly knew more about what their competitor company CEOs were making down the road and could demand from their boards more money. And the dynamics that were created by that reform did not conduce to less compensation, but more. There's been concern in recent years about the vulnerability of people who want to buy homes, ordinary people want to buy homes, to certain sorts of brokers on the mortgage market. And there was a kind of transparency fix there about disclosures, and evidence from the best evidence suggests that people often were not empowered by learning more about the terms of their mortgage. They couldn't make sense of that information. It's extremely complex. They couldn't shop around for another mortgage in any event. And but the disclosure strategy insulated predatory lenders from liability for fraud, because they could say then that they had made an appropriate disclosure. The theme here is that ordinary people who need the most protection from sophisticated corporate actors in consumer markets and health markets and financial markets are often in the worst position to make sense of complex disclosures and to be meaningfully empowered by those disclosures as against the companies. And yet we've placed more and more emphasis on the disclosure strategy in recent years. One more example, which I like. Here's a reform that I think every liberal I know, including me, was very positive about. It's called open file. In some jurisdictions in the U.S., including North Carolina, was an early one. It was announced that there would be a new so-called open file policy where the prosecution in a criminal case would make its investigatory files open well before trial to the criminal defendant. And this was thought to be very valuable because it would allow criminal defendants to have a better understanding of what the case was against them, and therefore make more intelligent decisions about whether or not to cut a plea deal or go to trial. It would also prevent prosecutors from hiding information that might be exculpatory, might show innocence till the last minute. And generally it seems, if you care about criminal justice, kind of hard to be against open file. But the best evidence so far and how it's working in those jurisdictions that have adopted it is that by itself, if you just do the transparency reform of open file, it's hard to see any measurable benefit to criminal defendants. It seems that open file has to be paired with more money for indigent defense, more money for lawyers for criminal defendants, and also stronger enforcement mechanisms for prosecutors who violate. So if you just do the transparency fix alone, just open up the files, most criminal defendants actually aren't able to use that information to their own advantage very effectively. You actually need some harder remedies to go along with it. You need more money for the criminal defense lawyers. So I think that speaks to a general point, which is that transparency is extremely valuable when used in combination with other regulatory strategies. What I think is really dangerous is when it takes the place of and stands in for what really needs to be a multifaceted approach to all these public problems. Transparency in itself is regulation light and often insufficient.
You mentioned in your paper that the same power dynamics might be happening in Congress as well.
Yeah.
Since we focus a lot on Congress and lobbying in our film, perhaps you could lay for the lay person why you see that open committees might not lead to progressive reform, and worse, may lead to capture or other scenarios.
So if you study the legislative history of a lot of the big reforms around opening up the congressional process and including committee hearings, you see a lot of references to the need to reduce the power of business lobbyists who were thought to be overly influential as against the public interest. But by now there's a good deal of evidence that when you have open hearings or open meetings, even though in theory the door is thrown open to everyone, who actually comes to the hearings and meetings on a systematic basis, and not only comes, but holds members of Congress to account if, depending on what they say and how they vote at every one of these hearings and meetings, are often deep-pocketed outfits that have the resources to do that kind of systematic monitoring of what members of Congress are doing. And those, it turns out, those are often business lobbyists. So in the past, a lot of this evidence is anecdotal, but politicians say they used to, they would still take meetings with business lobbyists, and the business lobbyists were still influential, but the business lobbyists didn't know necessarily how the politician had actually maneuvered behind the scenes to shape the legislation, or in some cases how they voted. And that gave a kind of buffer between the politician and the business lobby, some plausible deniability for the politician if they tried to pursue what they thought of as the public interest as against the lobbyist interest. In contrast, it seems like open hearings and open meetings have in many ways empowered business lobbyists to just pursue their narrow vision of accountability more aggressively as against other sorts of groups in society. So that's one story. Another part of the disappointment I think many people feel about these reforms is that the lobbyists themselves, in contrast, operate in substantial secrecy. So this goes back to the point we were talking about earlier about how it's not just that or necessarily that transparency law is too strong, so much as that it's skewed and where it opens, where it sheds light and where it doesn't. And in this case, many aspects of how Congress goes about drafting legislation have become quite open since the 1970s. How the lobbyists actually operate, who they're meeting with, how they're spending their resources remains substantially shrouded in secrecy. So the asymmetric effect of that regime is that is further to empower the lobbyists. So arguably that's another example of how if you're a certain sort of progressive who's interested in social democracy and public interested regulation, you might be quite worried about the distribution of secrecy and opacity in the current system. Really powerful corporations and their lobbyists are substantially less subject to transparency requirements than the government bodies that oversee them. And then within government, the most violent arms of the state, the national security, intelligence, and law enforcement agencies, are allowed to be the most secretive. And by contrast, the most visible agencies are those that, and the most potentially hamstrung by transparency, are those that are doing the bread and butter work of domestic regulation and enforcement.
Super interesting. Super interesting. All right. Can you call? I'm just going fast.
Yeah.
Questions we have, and then we can,
of course.
If you have more time, we can discuss.
Yeah, so, and I'm sorry, I will have to break at 2:30. Yeah. So.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right. Can you color the above answer with any real examples? For example, does congressional or even executive branch transparency create problems with healthcare, gun control, etc.?
One area that's been a particularly prominent field of struggle in the transparency world in the U.S. is environmental regulation. There are many examples of industry groups and right-wing groups that have targeted environmental scientists and environmental regulators with Freedom of Information Act requests in particular in hyper-adversarial ways. And it doesn't seem that these groups necessarily want to pursue some investigative story about how the agencies are regulating so much as just kind of tear down the work of these groups. So let me make it more concrete. Government scientists who work on issues like climate change have increasingly found themselves both at the federal level and at the state level targeted by groups that seek under open records law the emails, the personal emails of these scientists, which is itself viewed as quite intrusive by a lot of these individuals. And often the requests seem to be in a kind of bad faith. The goal is to shame and undermine the work of these scientists. So if you get everyone's email, if you get lots and lots of emails from pretty much anyone, you can often construct some kind of story, whether credibly or not, that there's something worrisome about how they're pursuing their jobs. And There's been a lot of effort to harass environmental scientists through these laws, and then once information is obtained about them, to discredit them. And it's in our current media environment and our kind of partisan filter bubbles where the right and the left consume different media, you don't even need to be right. It's often enough just to be able to say something about the work of any environmental scientist to create problems for them. The problem got so acute that there was a nonprofit founded, actually associated with Columbia, called something like the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund. I think I have that right. In recent years, its whole raison d'etre, its whole purpose, is to defend climate scientists from malicious freedom of information requests. That's the entire purpose of this nonprofit, because it becomes such a problem for people who want to work on issues like climate change and science that they were getting harassed through open records laws. State open records laws in the United States generally apply to public university researchers. If you work at a state institution, including a state university, you're subject to those laws. And there too, there's been an increasing move in recent years to go after academics who are at public universities who work on environmental issues. And there's a real concern that it's freezing up some of this work. It's creating a climate of fear, around the work, driving some people out of public universities into private universities. So I would say if there's one area above all others where the destructive potential of, extreme uses of these laws for oppositional purposes has been revealed in recent years, has been in the environmental regulation area.
You mentioned that the transparency reforms also created a chaotic and partisan environment in Congress. How might transparency lead to gridlock, partisanship, while also stifling legislative creativity each other?
So there's a lot of evidence now that there can be benefits to closed-door deliberations. And that when political officials must deliberate in public settings, they end up doing a lot of posturing, essentially. They can't necessarily deviate from their party's position, or else they may face a political cost for doing so. They can't necessarily negotiate with an open mind in a multidimensional search for good faith solutions. They become cartoons of themselves, and they play a role. They play a performative role rather than genuinely wrestle to find consensus. When the political parties are themselves extremely polarized, as they've become increasingly since the 1970s in the United States, this is a bit of a recipe for gridlock. So this is not really a neatly provable proposition, but it's at least plausible that the increasingly open conditions under which Congress works and deliberates, combined with extreme partisanship, have made it harder to get deals done. And deal making sounds a little crass or commercial, but it has real democratic value. It's part of the democratic value of action. Action to be responsive to people's needs and interests. I don't want to romanticize the old days of smoke-filled rooms, and it seems to me critically important that whatever deals are cut, once they're proposed, do become public, and that there can be robust deliberation on them, and that Congress not actually enact any policies in darkness. But at least for some phases of the deliberative process, there may be a case to be made for allowing certain forms of limited opacity. And this brings up a general point, which is I think reformers and scholars who work on transparency issues, one thing that will be really important going forward is what we might call more conditional thinking. That is, thinking about the conditions under which non-transparency is legitimate. Thinking in a more nuanced way about when are we okay with not having full transparency, Presumably, we're going to want transparency at some part of the policy process, particularly for policies that are actually coming into being. But when are we okay with allowing more space for secrecy so as to enable deal making and candid deliberation and so forth? And there's been the absolutist flavor to a lot of the transparency advocacy that we were talking about earlier has, I think, blunted that kind of instinct to think conditionally about transparency. So, but anyway, that's the opening up of Congress is in complicated ways bound up with its a diminishment of capacity over the years.
The title of your paper is Transparency's Ideological Drift.
Yeah.
And indeed, your paper looks into how the transparency reforms were from their inception and often still are associated by many with progressives, yet you discuss how this is not the case at all. Perhaps explain what this drift is and why it had happened.
So that's hard to do in any succinct way, because it's there are many facets to it. But I'll say a little.
Can we go over actually?
Yeah.
I need to stop this. Do you want me to ask you again the question?
No, take that question.
Yeah.
Well, it's fascinating when you go back and look at how the progressives in the early 1900s talked about transparency. They would have called it publicity. They did not just see it as a project of exposing, shaming, disciplining, and restraining government actors. Quite to the contrary, they wanted to produce more information, more sunlight, so as to enable more effective, in their language, scientific, democratic regulation. They wanted to empower the state to do more and do better. So to do that, they thought you needed to elicit information about what corporate actors were doing and what government bodies were doing, and then feed that back into the policy process. But they were quite explicit that the point wasn't just shrinking the state or getting the government out of our lives or exposing a few bad actors in government. The point was fundamentally to empower a more responsive and effective government to solve public problems. Some of that language also got taken up by the transparency reformers of the 60s and 70s. They started to focus a little less on big business compared to the progressives. But they also were quite clear that the goal was to make government more effective, more trusted, reduce the influence of special interests, particularly industry groups, and make government work for the ordinary person again. The transparency law has drifted quite far from those ideals in a number of ways. We've talked about how corporations themselves are the main beneficiaries of many of our leading transparency laws. They're able to do more effective lobbying in some respects under certain open meetings laws, open hearings laws. They're able to elicit more information from government and get leverage over regulators under the Freedom of Information Act. More generally, what we've kind of lost touch with the vision of transparency as a tool for making government more powerful, and even those non-corporate actors that seek transparency generally do it in an adversarial posture today. We haven't experienced the benefits from a public trust that we're hoped for. Transparency hasn't empowered the state in that way. And as we have also talked about, the distribution of transparency in government has relatively empowered the national security arms of the state, which are less subject to it as compared to the other arms of the state. So it's a multifaceted story of how the progressive vision of what transparency would do has not been realized. Where should I go with this? Maybe I'll pause there. I could go many ways, but I don't want to talk too long.
Okay. Next one.
Okay, yeah, why not?
We've discussed FOIA and Congress. What are some other areas where transparency have been applied only to lead to questionable outcomes?
Well, again, in all these areas, it's mixed. FOIA has many good things come of FOIA, so I don't want to tell a monochromatic story. But other areas where we see transparency pursued vigorously and not necessarily realizing the goals that we're hoped for include in the consumer protection area. Especially since the 80s, there's been many efforts to protect consumers by just having companies tell them more about the product, more about the terms of the loan, in ways that haven't necessarily actually resulted in meaningful consumer empowerment. In recent years, there's an open data movement, as it's sometimes called, to make more and more government information accessible online in a machine-readable form, which again sounds great in principle and has yielded some real good, but has also been a kind of handout to industry where the main users and beneficiaries of open data have often been corporations trying to corporations who basically have the technical skills and to make use of the data. The open data movement, moreover, often sounds strongly libertarian notes about how if we just get the data out there and free up the data, we can shrink the government, get it out of the way, let the private market figure it out. And there's a nearly theological faith in technology and private ordering that sometimes animates parts of that movement. So I guess I see a story of transparency not serving its initial progressive goals in the open records area, in the open meetings area, in the congressional process, in the open data area, in the consumer protection area. It's a pretty across the board shift we've experienced from transparency being celebrated for its potential to empower government and invigorate government, to transparency being used to disempower government and attack public regulation.
Do you have any thoughts on how voting for Supreme Court justices might work in the Senate if those votes were conducted by secret ballot?
That's an interesting question. I just have to be mindful of the time, and no, it's about 2:28. So I'm sorry, but
we have 2 more questions.
Let's do it. Okay, so yeah. I don't know if the Supreme Court model is generalizable to the Senate, but I do think if there's a general lesson about what we can take from the court to apply to other bodies, I think it's along the lines of what you're maybe suggesting. It seems from the experience of the court, that so long as there is true, meaningful transparency when it comes to the outputs of an institution, how it's actually going to rule, the policies it's actually going to adopt, it becomes a little less important to have full transparency as to the inputs, how it got there. If people have faith that there was a public interested product at the end of the day, then I think more secrecy in the deliberative stage becomes something to look into. So the court's a very small body. It's not overtly partisan. It has a distinctive kind of well of legitimacy from a lot of prior historical periods. It's the Senate is not the court. But that said, I do think that there's at least room to experiment with models of closed-door deliberation when paired with transparency afterwards. That we should at least be open to. I don't know of a perfect model, but I'm less confident about prescription, what we should do, than but what I'm more confident about is the diagnosis that there is a problem, and that we should be willing to experiment. Sorry, that was yeah.
That was perfect. Michael Sodson mentioned that you're contributing to a book.
Yeah.
That is coming together on this topic. Can you tell me a little more about the focus of that book?
Yeah, the book is called Troubling Transparency: The History and Future of Freedom of Information. It looks particularly at the Freedom of Information Act. It's a pretty diverse collection of perspectives on FOIA. So on the one hand, you have some traditional defenses of the law as critical for government accountability and recounting FOIA success stories. A lot of the positive literature on FOIA collects anecdotes of good uses of FOIA, or what are thought to be good uses of FOIA, and gets a lot of mileage out of them. There's also some discussion in the book about journalists' use of FOIA. Even though they're a small percent of the requesters, some journalists use it very effectively. Newspapers have been using it less and less, however, after the newspaper industry in the U.S. contracted in the mid-2000s. There's a real concern that newspaper reporters are using it less and less. But okay, so in the book you have some people making pretty traditional defenses of FOIA along classic liberal lines. But what's I think a little more interesting and surprising about the book is you have more and more people raising tough questions about the law. Some people are looking comparatively and finding ways in which the U.S. FOIA arguably lags the FOI laws of other countries. For example, the U.S. FOIA only applies to government bodies, only government agencies. Increasingly in other countries, the FOI laws apply to powerful private entities as well. That's another asymmetry, by the way, in our U.S. open government law, is that it's so much tougher on government than on the private sector. So you have some people looking comparatively to raise tough questions about how the U.S. FOIA is performing. And then you have some people just asking whether transparency might be moderated in some of the ways we've been discussing to enable more effective governance in some respects. So Cass Sunstein, for example, very prominent U.S. academic, is quite explicit about how he thinks what he calls input transparency about how the sausage is made, how government makes decisions, is far less valuable than output transparency about the actual decisions that government reaches, and we should be willing to trade input transparency for output transparency. There are complications to his argument. For example, some outputs at a certain time become inputs to government decisions down the line, and there's not a clean distinction. But I think in principle he's on to something. I would say, stepping out of it, that the book is reflective of how the transparency conversation, at least in the academy, is becoming more nuanced in recent years. One point that this raises, I just want to come back to it. We've been talking somewhat about the asymmetries woven into U.S. transparency law. This point about the government versus the private sector is a big one. There's this article I really like by a journalist in an obscure online magazine called Pando, where he observes, the writer, that in the progressive era, in the early 1900s, the great muckraking journalists were often trying to expose abuses of industry, corruption in big business, and not just in government. And he observes that in recent decades, it seems like investigative reporting has increasingly lasered in on government and to the neglect of looking at what powerful companies, private companies, are doing. And he wonders why that's come to be. I would suggest that the structure of transparency law is part of the answer. Transparency laws like FOIA give journalists a certain set of tools to seek information with a judicially enforceable right to get it if they don't like the response from government bodies and not from private bodies. And so journalists have been channeled kind of toward the state in their investigations, and they're doing important work in trying to identify abuses by the state. But we have to ask what they're not doing, and what they're not doing using our open government laws is going after powerful private bodies. So if you're a certain sort of liberal or progressive who thinks that we should worry about domination and injustice and inequality wherever in society we find it, whether in the government or in the private sector, you, I think, have reason to be concerned about a transparency regime that constantly guides investigators just toward one side of the public-private divide, just toward the state.
Well, we're pretty much done. The next question I think you've answered. It's the reception to your work on transparency, and if you feel like you're working in a bubble, or if you feel like there's growing interest. But I think I don't know. I feel like people are
like I'm not blowing anyone's mind. People are ready to hear this, and a lot of the empirical and theoretical foundation has been laid, and so it feels like it's a constructive conversation. The leap from the scholarly conversation to politics hasn't yet been made, but perhaps that will be the next step.
Do you have anything else to share? Or
No, and I'm sorry. I'm really gonna have to. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm gonna. I'm leaving the state actually.
Thank you so much.
These are great questions. Really thoughtful.
All right, this is off. This is